Why did some of the most brilliant minds in history prefer solitude? What leads great thinkers to feel repulsion towards social life? And is isolation a curse or a privilege reserved for the intellectually superior? Arthur Schopenhauer, one of the most pessimistic and visionary philosophers of the century, had an answer to these questions, and it was not kind to society. For him, the world was full of superficial people driven by petty impulses, trapped in empty conversations and banal distractions. Genius, by its very nature, required distance from this mediocre spectacle. As he himself wrote, solitude is the fate of all exceptional spirits. But was he right? Or is this disdain for social interaction merely a symptom of an inability to connect with others? Think of great names like Nikola Tesla, Emily Dickinson, or Isaac Newton, all known not only for their genius, but also for their isolation. Are they examples of intelligence that transcends the ordinary, or simply misunderstood souls condemned to wander the world alone? Today we will dive into Schopenhauer's ideas to understand why intelligent people seem to care less about social life, and whether this is truly an advantage or just a sophisticated form of alienation. For Schopenhauer, solitude was not a choice, but an inevitable consequence of intellectual superiority. The more a person stands out intellectually, the harder it becomes to find equals with whom to share deep ideas and feelings. Superior intelligence, in his view, creates a natural barrier between the individual and society, since the concerns and interests of the majority are radically different from those who see the world in a broader way. A man can only be himself while he is alone, and if he does not love solitude, he will not love freedom, for only when he is alone is he truly free. Solitude was not just a burden but a necessary refuge. He saw society as an environment where intellect was often suffocated by social expectations and the trivial interests of the majority. Schopenhauer observed that those who were intellectually superior often felt a sense of displacement when trying to interact with the ordinary world, because they saw beyond the obvious and understood realities that escaped general understanding. This isolation can be observed throughout history in brilliant figures. Nikola Tesla, for example, spent much of his life alone, avoiding human contact whenever possible, because he believed it interfered with his work. Friedrich Nietzsche, another thinker who valued solitude, claimed that the crowd is a sea in which free spirits drown. However, this isolation comes at a price. The need to distance oneself from social conventions can result in a deep sense of alienation. Schopenhauer recognized this dilemma and believed that although solitude could be liberating for great thinkers, it could also be a burden for the soul. That is why many of the greatest intellectuals in history went through periods of depression and anxiety, not because they were weak, but because they saw the world in a deeper way than most could ever conceive. And so the big question arises: is this isolation a curse or a blessing? For Schopenhauer, the answer was clear. He believed that great thinkers should accept solitude as a gift, because only in silence and away from social mediocrity could they truly achieve their greatest accomplishments. Schopenhauer did not see social life as a space for genuine exchange or authentic connection, but as a great theater where individuals played predefined roles, trapped in an endless performance of appearances and selfish interests. For him, society was nothing more than a stage where people act for one another, hiding their true intentions behind carefully constructed masks. Sociability, for the majority, was merely a mask that concealed their banality. This pessimistic view was directly linked to his main work, The World as Will and Representation, where he argued that everything we perceive is nothing more than a projection of our mind. For him, social life was just an illusion, a spectacle that distracts individuals from true knowledge about themselves and the nature of the world. Schopenhauer believed that most people live trapped in trivial concerns, status, gossip, small disputes for power and recognition. In his view, the average human being was a slave to the will, a blind and irrational impulse that governs our actions and keeps us trapped in endless desires. The search for social validation was nothing more than a reflection of this uncontrollable will. This disdain for social life was not exclusive to Schopenhauer. Other great thinkers also expressed their contempt for the superficiality of society. Nietzsche, for example, said that convictions are more dangerous enemies of truth than lies. He emphasized how people prefer to cling to illusions rather than face reality honestly. This conflict between the pursuit of knowledge and the demands of social life created an unbridgeable gap that made isolation inevitable. But there is a side effect. Prolonged solitude can lead to disillusionment, apathy, and even contempt for the external world. Schopenhauer was well aware of this reality and warned that for those who could see beyond social illusion, the only alternative was to accept this harsh truth and learn to live with it. But how does this isolation manifest in everyday life? Why do those who are intellectually superior often feel frustrated with social interactions? Schopenhauer did not hold back in expressing his view of humanity. For him, most people were driven by superficial and selfish interests, with no inclination toward contemplation or deep thought. This created an inevitable gap between the intellectually elevated and the masses, whom he saw as distracted by trivialities and frivolities. Mediocrity usually recognizes only itself, while genius sees that mediocrity but finds itself alone. This intellectual isolation occurs because the thinker, by nature, seeks to understand the world deeply, while most people are concerned with trivialities such as status or fleeting entertainment. The genius seeks to unravel the mysteries of existence, but when trying to share ideas, often encounters indifference or misunderstanding. This helps explain why so many great thinkers felt frustrated with society. Schopenhauer himself despised interaction with ordinary people, believing that the mediocrity of the majority suffocated the genius of the few. This idea echoes in Voltaire's famous phrase, "The secret to boring people is to tell them everything you know." The problem is not only the difficulty of communication, but the difference in interests. The genius seeks universal truths, while the majority seeks pleasure and distraction. For Schopenhauer, this intellectual imbalance made social interaction a burden for those with elevated minds. Nikola Tesla, for example, avoided social events and trivial interactions because he saw them as a waste of time. Isaac Newton was known for his isolation and impatience with banal conversations, and even Albert Einstein admitted that he preferred solitude to the company of people who did not share his interest in deep ideas. However, this distancing from society does not occur only by the genius's choice. Often, it is society itself that rejects those who think differently. Innovative and unconventional thinking tends to cause discomfort and resistance. Nietzsche called this the resentment of mediocrity, the tendency of the majority to despise and attack what it does not understand or what makes it feel inferior. Thus, the genius does not withdraw only by choice, but is also pushed away by the hostility of the world around him. This forced distancing can generate feelings of alienation and even contempt for social life. Given this, a question arises. If the world is a hostile place for great thinkers, how should they face this reality? Schopenhauer believed there was a solution, and it was not trying to fit into society, but accepting and cultivating solitude as a refuge for thought and contemplation. Solitude, for Schopenhauer, is both a destiny and a choice. He saw isolation as an inevitable result of superior intelligence, but also as an opportunity for intellectual and spiritual growth. The ordinary man cannot bear solitude because he feels comfortable only in the company of others, while the elevated man seeks solitude because in it he finds himself. This view leads to an essential point. Solitude is not a punishment, but a privilege. It offers the thinker the chance to immerse himself in his own ideas, without distractions, and without the need to conform to empty social interactions that dominate everyday life. It is in this silent space that creativity flourishes and understanding deepens. Many of the greatest thinkers, scientists, and artists in history made solitude their inseparable companion. Emily Dickinson spent much of her life isolated at home, dedicating herself exclusively to writing. Kant was known for his meticulous routine and his disdain for social events. Beethoven, amid his growing deafness, found in solitude the strength to create some of the most powerful symphonies in history. Solitude not only allows for greater depth of thought but also preserves the authenticity of genius. Schopenhauer believed that by becoming too involved with society, the brilliant mind risks getting lost in distractions and compromising its clarity of vision. This perspective resonates with the Buddhist concept of detachment, one of Schopenhauer's major philosophical influences. Buddhism teaches that attachment to the external world and social interactions often generates suffering. True growth occurs in introspection and in freeing oneself from the illusions of the material world. However, there is a dilemma in this choice. Human beings are, by nature, social animals. The need for belonging is part of our biology, and prolonged solitude can generate anguish and melancholy. Even the greatest thinkers, despite valuing isolation, suffered from the lack of meaningful connections. Nietzsche, for example, also saw solitude as a path to greatness, but admitted that it could be painful. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he describes the philosopher as a hermit who descends from the mountain to share his wisdom, but encounters rejection and misunderstanding. This dilemma is real. Distancing oneself from society brings freedom, but also imposes an existential burden that is difficult to bear. Schopenhauer, however, had a solution. He believed that although the genius could never fully fit into society, there was a way to interact with the world without being consumed by its mediocrity. The key, for him, was to adopt philosophical detachment, a kind of emotional neutrality that allows one to live among others without becoming too involved. This leads to the central question: how to navigate the world without being absorbed by its superficiality. If having a brilliant mind means ending up alone, how do great thinkers manage to live in society without feeling suffocated by so much triviality? Schopenhauer had an answer: philosophical detachment. For him, happiness belonged to those who are self-sufficient. The secret was not trying to fit in or change others, but cultivating a calm distance, like an observer who analyzes reality without being affected by it. Instead of fighting the mediocrity of the world, the thinker should learn to face it like a scientist observing an experiment, with curiosity, but without emotional involvement. This means accepting the triviality of social life without irritation, understanding the intellectual limitations of the majority without frustration, and maintaining one's mental independence without seeking external validation. This approach resembles that of the Stoics, who advocated controlling emotions in the face of adversity. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his Meditations, "Give yourself the gift of being indifferent to what is outside your control. The world will always be full of empty distractions and superficial conversations, but it is the individual who decides how much of it deserves attention." The thinker should not isolate completely from society, but interact with it strategically, absorbing only what is useful and discarding what is irrelevant. Although Schopenhauer had little patience for society, he did not believe that total isolation was the solution. He knew that even great thinkers needed a minimum of human contact, whether to exchange ideas or to avoid absolute solitude. The secret, according to him, was to choose carefully whom to connect with and to keep interactions to the necessary minimum, just enough to live in the world without going insane. This philosophy applies well today in a world full of digital distractions, fake news, and shallow relationships. Knowing how to filter information and interactions has become essential. Intelligence is not only understanding the world, but also knowing how to navigate it without getting lost. Schopenhauer teaches that instead of lamenting the lack of connection with most people, we should see it as a mark of intellectual freedom. After all, solitude can be a burden, but it is also a privilege, an opportunity to explore our own thoughts without external interference. Now the question arises: do you prefer to adapt to the world or accept it as it is while preserving your intellectual freedom? If you have made it this far, you have probably realized that the relationship between intelligence and isolation is not just a whim of fate, but a natural consequence of deep thinking. Schopenhauer showed that great minds often find more comfort in solitude than in the company of the crowd, not out of arrogance, but because the superficiality of social interactions can be exhausting for those who see beyond appearances.